When most people imagine what happens when an empath heals, they picture someone who's finally learned to shut it all out. They envision thick walls, emotional detachment, maybe even a kind of controlled coldness. The healed empath, they think, must have found a way to stop feeling so much. But this couldn't be further from the truth, and it's a dangerous misconception that keeps many empaths trapped in their suffering. What actually happens is far more nuanced and, frankly, far more interesting. The healed empath doesn't become less sensitive, they become selectively conductive. And there's a world of difference between these two states. Think about what a conductor does in an orchestra. They don't create the music themselves, nor do they absorb every note into their body and hold it there. They receive the sound, they feel it, they understand it intimately, and then they allow it to move through them and outward with intention and purpose. This is precisely what happens to an empath who has done the deep work of healing. They develop what I call emotional conductivity, rather than emotional absorption. Before healing, the empath operates like a sponge thrown into an ocean. Every wave, every current, every particle of salt water gets soaked up until they're completely saturated, heavy, waterlogged. They can't tell where the ocean ends, and they begin. Someone else's anxiety becomes their anxiety. A stranger's grief at the grocery store becomes something they carry home and place on their own shoulders. A friend's anger doesn't just affect them, it inhabits them, sometimes for days. This isn't empathy in its truest form. This is what happens when someone hasn't yet learned the fundamental truth that feeling with someone is not the same as feeling for them, and neither is the same as becoming them. The shift to conductivity requires understanding something essential about the nature of emotions themselves. Emotions are energy. They're meant to move, to flow, to pass through. When an empath learns to become a conductor rather than a container, they're actually honoring the natural physics of emotional energy. They create an internal space where they can recognize, this is profound sadness I'm sensing, without immediately translating that into, I am profoundly sad. This distinction might sound subtle, but it's revolutionary in practice. It means you can sit with someone in their darkest moment, truly feel the weight of what they're experiencing, offer genuine presence and understanding, and then, and this is critical, you can leave that room without carrying their darkness out with you. Not because you've gone numb, but because you've learned that their emotions belong to them, and yours belong to you. The healed empath develops what we might call permeable boundaries. Not walls, not armor, but something more like a membrane that allows for connection while maintaining distinction. They can let emotional information flow through their awareness without letting it take up permanent residence in their nervous system. They become exquisitely attuned to the difference between compassion and enmeshment, between presence and fusion. And here's what's remarkable. This selective conductivity actually makes the healed empath more effective, not less. When you're not drowning in everyone else's emotional experience, you have the clarity to truly see what's happening. You have the stability to offer real support rather than just adding your own reactivity to the situation. You become a grounding presence rather than another person who needs to be managed or soothed. The unhealed empath exhausts everyone around them with their intensity, their constant overwhelm, their inability to separate. The healed empath offers something far more valuable, the gift of being truly seen without being consumed. Now let's talk about what might be the most misunderstood aspect of the healed empath's transformation: the radical reframing of boundaries themselves. There's this pervasive narrative in our culture that boundaries are inherently selfish, that they're barriers we erect to keep people out, to protect ourselves at others' expense. And for the empath who has spent a lifetime believing their value lies in their availability, in their willingness to give endlessly, the very idea of setting a boundary can feel like a moral failing. It feels like shutting the door on someone who needs you. It feels like becoming the kind of person you've spent your whole life trying not to be. But here's what the healed empath comes to understand. Boundaries are not walls. They're not acts of rejection. They're actually the only way that authentic love becomes possible. Think about it from a physiological perspective for a moment. Your body has boundaries. Your skin, your cellular membranes, your immune system. These boundaries don't exist to isolate you from the world. They exist so that you can engage with the world without being destroyed by it. Your skin allows you to feel the warmth of the sun without being burned to a crisp. Your immune system allows you to coexist with bacteria without being consumed by infection. The boundary is what makes relationship possible, not what prevents it. The same is true emotionally and psychologically. When an empath has no boundaries, what they're offering isn't really love. It's a kind of boundless merging that ultimately serves no one. You cannot genuinely love someone if you've dissolved yourself in the process. You cannot offer real support from a place of depletion and resentment. And make no mistake, the boundaryless empath always eventually arrives at resentment. How could they not? They're giving from an empty cup, overriding their own needs, silencing their own truth, and then feeling bitter when others don't recognize their sacrifice. The healed empath recognizes this pattern for what it is, not love, but a complex adaptation to early relational trauma. Somewhere along the way, they learned that their needs didn't matter, that their purpose was to manage other people's emotional states, that their survival depended on being useful, available, indispensable. The absence of boundaries isn't generosity. It's a survival strategy masquerading as virtue. When you heal, you begin to see that saying no to what depletes you is actually saying yes to your capacity for genuine presence. When you protect your energy, you're ensuring that what you do give comes from a place of fullness rather than obligation. And perhaps most importantly, when you stop rescuing people from the consequences of their own choices, you give them something far more valuable than your intervention. You give them the opportunity to develop their own strength, their own resilience, their own solutions. This is where the boundary becomes an act of love, not just for yourself, but for the other person as well. Every time you rush in to fix, to save, to absorb someone else's discomfort, you were implicitly sending them a message: I don't believe you can handle this. I don't trust your capacity to navigate your own life. That's not compassion. That's a subtle form of control wrapped in the language of care. The healed empath learns to trust others with their own journeys. They learn that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is step back and let someone struggle, let someone feel their feelings, let someone figure it out on their own, not from a place of coldness or indifference, but from a deep respect for that person's autonomy and developmental process. And here's the paradox. When you stop being available for everything, you become truly available for what matters. When you stop saying yes to everything, your yes actually means something. People can trust that when you show up, you're really there, not performing care while secretly depleting yourself, not tallying invisible debts, not waiting for recognition that will never feel like enough. True generosity requires a self to give from. Boundaries are how you preserve that self. Leaves the audience with something to 11:26 a.m. This brings us to perhaps the most painful identity to release on the healing journey, the role of the martyr, the perpetual wounded healer, the one who finds purpose in suffering alongside others. There's something seductive about this identity, isn't there? It gives meaning to pain. It transforms personal struggle into a kind of credential, a badge of authenticity. I understand your suffering because I'm suffering too. I can help you because I know what it's like to be broken. And in a culture that often mistakes trauma for depth and exhaustion for dedication, this martyrdom can even be celebrated, rewarded, held up as the highest form of service. But let me be clear, this is not healing. This is trauma bonding dressed up as purpose. The unhealed empath often builds their entire sense of worth on their capacity to rescue, to fix, to carry what others cannot carry themselves. They become addicted to being needed because somewhere deep in their psyche, they've internalized the belief that they have no inherent value, that they must earn their place in the world through constant service, through perpetual self-sacrifice. They confuse their worth with their usefulness, their identity with their function. And here's what makes this pattern so insidious. It works, at least superficially. People do need help. There is real suffering in the world. When you position yourself as the one who will always be there, who will never say no, who will absorb everyone's pain, you will never run out of takers. You will always be needed. But needed is not the same as valued, and being indispensable is not the same as being loved. The healed empath has to confront a devastating question. Who am I if I'm not the helper? Who am I if I'm not carrying someone else's burden? If I stop defining myself by my wounds, by my capacity to endure, by my willingness to sacrifice, what's left? This is the existential crisis at the heart of the healing process, and it cannot be bypassed. You have to be willing to find out who you are when you're not performing rescue operations. You have to discover whether you have an identity beyond your trauma and your service to others. What emerges on the other side of this crisis is something far more powerful than martyrdom. It's sovereignty. It's the recognition that your worth is inherent, not earned. That you don't have to suffer to deserve rest, don't have to fix everyone to deserve love, don't have to be perpetually available to deserve existence. The healed empath stops wearing their scars as badges of honor and starts treating them as what they actually are, wounds that deserve to heal. They recognize that continuing to identify with their trauma keeps them tethered to it, that there's a profound difference between acknowledging your past and living in it permanently. And this shift, from martyrdom to empowerment, actually makes you more effective in the world, not less. When you model self-respect, when you demonstrate that healing is possible, when you show people what it looks like to honor your own needs while still caring for others, you give them permission to do the same. You become a living example of integration rather than a cautionary tale of depletion. The martyr says, "Look how much I can endure." The empowered empath says, "Look what becomes possible when you stop abandoning yourself." There's a reason airplane safety instructions tell you to put on your own oxygen mask first. It's not selfishness, it's physics. You cannot give what you don't have. You cannot model wholeness while fragmenting yours. And you cannot truly serve others from a place of self-abandonment. The healed empath understands this at a cellular level. They stop confusing self-sacrifice with love and start recognizing it for what it often is, an unconscious repetition of early relational patterns where their needs were consistently subordinated to others. They break the cycle not by becoming selfish, but by becoming whole. Your healing is not something you do in spite of your desire to help others. It's the most important contribution you can make. Once the empath has released the need to be everything to everyone, something remarkable happens. They develop discernment, and this might be the most practical, day-to-day transformation of the healing journey. Before healing, the empath operates in a state of what I call emotional democracy. Every feeling gets equal weight. Every person's need feels equally urgent. Every situation demands immediate attention. There's no hierarchy, no filtering system, no inner compass that says this matters and this doesn't. It's all just an overwhelming flood of input with no way to prioritize or process. This is exhausting, of course, but it's also something deeper. It's a fundamental confusion about responsibility. The unhealed empath hasn't yet learned to distinguish between what's theirs to feel and what belongs to someone else, between what's theirs to solve and what isn't, between genuine intuition and anxiety, between compassion and compulsion. Think about what happens in the nervous system of someone without discernment. They walk into a room and immediately begin scanning for emotional data. Who's upset? Who needs something? Where's the tension? What needs to be fixed? Their entire system goes on high alert, not because there's an actual threat, but because they've been conditioned to believe that any emotional discomfort in their environment is simultaneously their responsibility and their emergency. This is people-pleasing at the neurological level. It's the autonomic nervous system stuck in a pattern of hypervigilance, constantly monitoring others' states to determine how to be, what to do, whether it's safe. And crucially, this pattern didn't develop because the empath is particularly noble or caring. It developed as a survival mechanism, usually in childhood, when accurately reading and managing the emotional climate of their environment was literally a matter of emotional or sometimes even physical safety. The healed empath begins to recognize this pattern for what it is, not a superpower, but a trauma response. And with that recognition comes the possibility of choice. Discernment means developing the capacity to ask crucial questions. Is this mine? Does this require my energy right now? Am I responding to what's actually happening, or am I responding to old programming? Is this genuine compassion, or is this my anxiety convincing me that I'm responsible for managing everyone's emotional state? These questions create space between stimulus and response. They interrupt the automatic pattern of absorption and reaction. And in that space, something new becomes possible: intentionality. The healed empath learns to recognize that just because they can feel something doesn't mean they need to do something about it. Just because someone is struggling doesn't mean they're being called to intervene. Just because they have the capacity to help doesn't mean they have the responsibility to help in every situation, every time. This isn't callousness, this is wisdom. It's understanding that your energy is finite, that your presence is valuable, and that scattering yourself across every emotional need you encounter serves no one, least of all the people you're trying to help. What emerges is the ability to recognize where you're truly needed, versus where you're simply responding to old conditioning. You start to notice the difference between genuine connection and performative care, between authentic concern and the compulsive need to fix. You develop what might be called emotional literacy, the ability to read your own responses with clarity and honesty. And perhaps most importantly, discernment allows you to recognize which emotions are actually yours. Because here's something the unhealed empath rarely considers. Sometimes what feels like empathy is actually projection. Sometimes what you think you're sensing in others is really your own unprocessed emotion that you've externalized, because it feels safer to manage in someone else than to acknowledge in yourself. The healed empath gets curious about this. When they feel overwhelmed by someone else's anxiety, they pause and ask, is this their anxiety I'm feeling? Or is this my anxiety that their situation has triggered? Am I responding to them, or am I responding to my own unexamined fears? This kind of self-inquiry requires tremendous honesty. It means admitting that your empathy isn't always accurate, that your impulse to help isn't always pure, that sometimes you're more invested in being needed than in what the other person actually needs. But this honesty is liberating, because when you stop trying to feel and fix everything, you create space to truly discern what deserves your attention, your energy, your care. You become selective, not out of selfishness, but out of respect for yourself, for others, and for the finite nature of human capacity. Not every cry for help is yours to answer. Wisdom is knowing which ones are. Now here's where many people get confused about what healing actually means for someone who's deeply sensitive. There's this assumption that to stop being overwhelmed by emotion, you must close yourself off to it. That the only way to protect yourself from feeling too much is to feel less. That healing means building armor, developing a thick skin, becoming impervious. But this is a tragic misunderstanding of what strength actually is. The healed empath doesn't diminish their sensitivity. They don't suppress their emotional depth or train themselves to become numb. What they do is fundamentally reframe their relationship to vulnerability itself. They learn to be vulnerable on purpose, rather than vulnerable by default. Let me explain what I mean by this distinction. The unhealed empath is in a state of constant, uncontrolled openness. They're emotionally exposed all the time, to everyone, in every situation. It's not a choice, it's a chronic condition. Their sensitivity feels like a wound that never closes, a nerve ending that's always firing, a door that won't shut no matter how much it needs to. This kind of vulnerability isn't strength, it's a lack of containment. It's what happens when someone hasn't developed the psychological structures necessary to regulate their own emotional experience. And because it's so overwhelming, so exhausting, so often painful, the natural response is to swing to the opposite extreme, to shut down entirely, to construct walls, to go numb. But there's a third option, and it's the one the healed empath discovers. It's the capacity to be exquisitely sensitive and simultaneously boundaried, to feel deeply without being destabilized, to remain open without being defenseless. This requires a complete reconceptualization of what vulnerability means. In the work of researchers like Bree Brown, we've come to understand vulnerability as the willingness to be seen, to risk connection, to show up authentically even when the outcome is uncertain. But what often gets lost in these conversations is that true vulnerability requires a stable self to be vulnerable from. You cannot be genuinely vulnerable if you have no sense of where you end and others begin. That's not vulnerability, that's dissolution. Real vulnerability is an act of courage precisely because you have something to risk. You have a self that could be hurt, judged, rejected, and you choose to show up anyway. The healed empath develops what we might call boundaried openness. They create an internal architecture that allows them to feel without fragmenting, to connect without merging, to be touched by life without being destroyed by it. Their sensitivity becomes a choice they make rather than a condition they endure. And this is where the real power emerges. When you're vulnerable intentionally, you get to decide when, where, how, and with whom you open yourself. You're no longer at the mercy of every emotional current that passes through your environment. You can choose to lean into deep feeling in contexts where it serves you and others, and you can choose to maintain appropriate distance in situations where that level of openness would be harmful or inappropriate. This is what emotional maturity actually looks like for the sensitive person. It's not about becoming less sensitive. It's about becoming more sovereign in your sensitivity. Think about it in terms of physical strength. A strong person isn't someone who's rigid, who can't bend, who's inflexible. That's brittleness, not strength. True strength includes flexibility, adaptability, resilience. You can absorb impact without shattering. You can bend without breaking. You can be soft in some moments and firm in others, depending on what the situation requires. The same is true emotionally. The healed empath develops emotional strength, not by armoring up, but by becoming more flexible, more resilient, more capable of modulating their responses. They can be tender without being fragile. They can be open without being overwhelmed. They can feel everything and still maintain their center. This also means they stop treating their sensitivity as a liability and start recognizing it as one of their greatest assets, when it's properly contained and directed. Deep feeling becomes a source of wisdom, of insight, of connection, rather than a constant source of pain and depletion. But here's the crucial part. This kind of boundaried vulnerability requires ongoing practice and self-awareness. It means continually checking in with yourself, noticing when you're slipping into old patterns of unlimited openness, recognizing when you need to pull back and resource yourself. It means developing what's sometimes called titration, the ability to dose your exposure to intense emotion, to let in what you can handle and metabolize rather than flooding yourself constantly. The healed empath becomes a master of their own nervous system. They learn what regulates, then what dysregulates them, what they need to return to baseline after deep emotional work. They develop practices, rituals, boundaries that protect their capacity to feel without being consumed by feeling. And paradoxically, this containment actually allows for deeper vulnerability, not less. When you know you can regulate yourself, when you trust your own resilience, when you have structures in place to support you, you can afford to open yourself more fully in the moments and relationships where that's appropriate. You're not in constant self-protection mode because you've created conditions where protection and openness can coexist. The armor was never the answer. Learning when to open and when to close is. And now we arrive at what might be the most counterintuitive transformation of all. The healed empath stops trying to save people. I know this sounds almost heretical, especially in a culture that valorizes helpers and fixers and people who dedicate themselves to alleviating others' suffering. But stay with me here, because what replaces the savior complex is something far more profound and ultimately far more helpful. The unhealed empath operates from what I call the fixing impulse. Someone shares a problem, and immediately the empath goes into solution mode. Someone expresses pain, and the empath rushes in to take it away. Someone is struggling, and the empath believes their job is to struggle for them, to carry what feels too heavy, to solve what feels unsolvable. This seems compassionate on the surface. But if we look deeper, we have to ask, whose needs are actually being met in this dynamic? Because here's what the unhealed empath rarely admits. Even to themselves, the compulsion to fix others is often about managing their own discomfort with witnessing suffering. It's about the anxiety that arises when you can't make everything okay. It's about the deep, often unconscious belief that you're responsible for other people's emotional states. And if they're not okay, then you failed somehow. This isn't really about the other person at all. It's about you. It's about your need to feel effective, needed, valuable. It's about your inability to sit with the discomfort of not having the answer, not being able to make it better, not being in control. And more importantly, when you rush in to fix, to save, to do the work for someone else, you're operating from a fundamental lack of respect for that person's process, their autonomy, their capacity. You're essentially saying, I don't trust you to handle this. I don't believe you can find your own way. I need to do it for you. This is disempowering, even when it's well-intentioned. It keeps people dependent. It prevents them from developing their own resources, their own resilience, their own solutions. And it creates a dynamic where you become indispensable, not because you're genuinely helpful, but because you've made yourself the intermediary between someone and their own power. The healed empath recognizes this pattern and makes a radical shift. Instead of jumping in to fix, they learn to hold space. Instead of providing answers, they ask questions that help the other person access their own wisdom. Instead of rescuing, they become what I call a mirror, reflecting back to people their own strength, their own capacity, their own potential. This is much harder than fixing. It requires you to tolerate the discomfort of watching someone struggle when you could intervene. It requires faith in other people's developmental process, even when that process is messy and painful. It requires you to relinquish control and trust that people are capable of our own transformation. But this is where real healing happens, not in your intervention, but in someone's discovery of their own agency. Think about the difference between these two approaches. The fixer says, "Here's what you should do. Let me handle this for you. I'll make it better." The mirror says, "What do you think you need? What's becoming clear to you? What would it look like if you trusted yourself here?" The fixer centers themselves in the other person's story. The mirror deflects attention back to where it belongs, to the person who's actually living the experience. And here's what's remarkable. When you stop doing the work for people, they often surprise you. They find resources you didn't know they had. They discover solutions you never would have thought of. They prove themselves more capable than you gave them credit for. Because you created space for their own emergence, instead of crowding that space with your need to be helpful. This doesn't mean the healed empath becomes passive or indifferent. It means they become discerning about when intervention actually serves and when it infantilizes. It means they understand that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is step back and trust someone with their own life. There's a concept in therapy called non-anxious presence. The ability to be with someone in their struggle without becoming activated by it, without needing to make it go away, without taking it on as your own emergency. This is what the healed empath offers. They can sit with intensity, with uncertainty, with pain, without rushing to resolve it. They trust the process, they trust the person, and they trust that their role isn't to provide rescue, but to provide witness. This is actually a more mature form of compassion. It's compassion that respects autonomy. It's compassion that believes in people's capacity for their own healing. It's compassion that understands that struggle is often the crucible of growth, and that protecting people from all discomfort is actually protecting them from development. The healed empath learns to ask themselves, am I helping this person, or am I helping myself feel less anxious about this person's struggle? Am I responding to what they're actually asking for, or am I responding to my own compulsion to fix? Will my intervention genuinely serve their growth, or will it keep them dependent on me? These are uncomfortable questions. They require brutal honesty about your motivations, but they're essential if you want to move from savior to mirror, from fixer to facilitator. And in making this shift, something profound happens. People start coming to you not because you'll solve their problems, but because you help them access their own problem-solving capacity. Not because you'll carry their burdens, but because you remind them of their own strength. Not because you have all the answers, but because you ask the questions that help them find their own. The healed empath becomes a catalyst for other people's empowerment rather than an obstacle to it. Your job was never to save anyone. It was to help them remember they can save themselves.